Welcome to the Omnibus Podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Munson, State Representative from District 23B in southern Minnesota. This week on the podcast, we'll be introducing a new segment called Legislating. Well, I'll walk through each week a legislative process to disclose to you how things are happening here in St. Paul, how committee chairs are chosen. Let's talk about omnibus bills. Let's talk about the 24-hour rule. Or this week, we talk about vehicle bills and how they are an abuse and against our Constitution. We talk about a couple of bills, House File 6, which is the Promise Act to rebuild Minneapolis, a promise made by Democrats, and House File 9, an elections omnibus bill, which has some pretty disgusting stuff in it. Then I sit down with Don Huizenga, who is the chair of the Minnesota Voters Alliance, and we talk about the last citizen class president, Donald Trump. Don and I met at the inauguration of our president 4 years ago in Washington, D.C. We'll talk about what happened at the inauguration 4 years ago. We'll talk about elections, election integrity. It's going to be a great show for you, so thank you so much for listening to the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane. So in this week's episode of the Omnibus Podcast, I'm going to start a new segment called Legislating. I'm stealing the term from one that Representative Tim Miller uses, so he gets credit for that. But in legislating, we're going to do a quick segment to discuss a legislative process that much of the public may not be aware of, and to try to bring more transparency into how legislators up here in St. Paul are really abusing the legislature. So our state constitution, Article 4, Section 19, deals with the reporting of bills. It says every bill shall be reported on 3 different days in each house, unless, in case of an urgency, 2/3 of the House where the bill is pending deem it expedient to dispense with this rule. So what does this mean? It means in order to make sure a bill is properly vetted, you can't just bring up legislation at the last minute and cram it through. You need to have it read on the House floor once and on 3 separate days so that the public can be notified, the public can participate and bring in their opinions, and hopefully the bill will be assigned to committees where it can be vetted and improved. The Constitution creates a process for legislating that slows it down so that through that process and engagement with each other, legislators can make things better. The legislature has found a way to go around this constitutional requirement by creating vehicle bills. You see, they'll introduce a bill. For instance, last year there was a bill that came through Health and Human Services called a bill for an act requiring a legislative report on legislative reports. I actually saw this bill, thought it was the dumbest bill ever, and made a graphic called Dumb Bill of the Week I started posting, and it made my list of dumb bills of the week. When it came to the Health and Human Services Committee, I was shocked, and I was told by the chair of the committee, oh, it's just a vehicle bill, just pass it. So everyone but me passed this bill through committee, and it went and got its second reading, and then it sat on the House register waiting at the finish line, ready to become law. And if the majority needed to cram through 1,000 pages of legislation at the very last minute, all they have to do is write that bill as a delete everything amendment or a DE amendment to a vehicle bill. And it'll wipe out all the text in the vehicle bill and replace it with 1,000 pages of garbage that has not seen the light of day and hasn't been vetted in committee, but has a majority of votes of people who want it. And that bill, technically, has been read 3 times on the House floor, so it meets the definition constitutionally of being read 3 times. So vehicle bills are an abuse of the legislative process. It's a way that legislators on the right and the left have both agreed this is the practice of getting around the constitutional requirement of thoroughly vetting legislation and engaging with the public. So this is a major abuse to our legislative process, and I believe that it's important that you know about this and you can watch this unfold on the House floor and hopefully bring criticism to the legislators who participate in this abusive process. So I hope this segment of legislating was somewhat helpful and enlightening, and I hope to bring more little short segments like this to explain a process. I'm not an expert on everything, but as a new legislator up here, I found this practice to be really horrific in how it's done. We need to have a more responsible and accountable legislature, and this is not the right approach. The reviser is still backlogged with a lot of legislation that has not been introduced yet. We have had 4 days on the floor, and this is where legislation can be introduced. So out of the 4 days on the floor, we've had 250 bills introduced and had their first reading. One of those bills is kind of raising some eyebrows. It's House File 6, and it's introduced by about a dozen pretty far left Democrat authors. The chief author is Mohammed Noor, and the bill is called the Promise Act, and it's a big honkin' community repair bill for the city of Minneapolis. It creates relief programs. It does a lot of redevelopment corporation established, like a lot of money in pork and property tax abatement, civil unrest investigatory commission established, and of course, the 2 big words, money appropriated. Now, what's also interesting, I mean, in the legislature here, we have a lot of debate going on behind the scenes about the protest. That was a peaceful protest here at the Capitol. They had the protest and insurrection, the riot in D.C., and, Republicans are under fire for trying to compare what happened in D.C. to what happened after George Floyd died. This bill starts out, and I want to read this text to you because you might find this interesting. Legislative findings. This is a bill we have to vote on. The legislature recognizes the civil unrest that occurred in Minnesota in May and June of 2020. And while the immediate cause of the unrest was the apparent murder of George Floyd by an officer of the Minneapolis Police Department, it was compounded by other long-standing structural systems of inequality and racism within the city, state, and nation. The legislature finds that the resulting protests and acts of civil disobedience were largely a peaceful exercise of First Amendment rights. A genuine expression of grief at the death of Mr. Floyd, and frustration and anger at the lack of an adequate mechanism for communities long unheard or ignored by public institutions to have their voices heard and meaningful action taken as a result. Now, the legislature further recognizes that some of the protests and acts of civil disobedience occurring among a small minority of participants led to severe destruction and damage to small businesses and other private property in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and other areas of the state. So what I want to say about that first part is it really justifies all of the protests and civil disobedience and action and says, it was mostly peaceful. And that's, the headlines that said fiery but mostly peaceful protests, I think was frustrating for a lot of Americans to read. But the second part of this is said it goes in to say the legislature further recognizes that some of the acts of protest and civil disobedience occurring among a small minority of the participants led to severe destruction or damage to small businesses and other private property in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and other areas of the state. In many cases, the damage and destruction impacted businesses and locations owned, managed, or frequented by those communities that the acts of protest and civil disobedience were intended to uplift. The physical and psychological toll from this devastation is immense and touches all Minnesotans. So it recognizes that most of the riots and destruction happened in the very communities of the people that they were trying to help. So this bill goes through and lays out all of these, economic zones and property tax abatement and a bunch of things it wants to do, but it's really the Rebuild Minneapolis bill. And it uses a really fiery language at the beginning as justification of what happened. And of course, it says, uses the words apparent murder of George Floyd while we're in the middle of a court case here in Minneapolis. So this bill is going to be really interesting. And of course, Republicans will have to vote on this bill. I think most of our constituents in rural Minnesota are a big fat no, but we'll have for interesting debate and amendments likely offered on this bill as it comes to the floor. Another bill I think you'll find interesting that was introduced is House File 9. This was introduced by a freshman, Representative Greenman, and this is an omnibus elections bill and really goes through and erodes any level of election security that we thought we had left. And then it also lowers the voting age to 16. And really, it forces all people going to get a learner's permit to be automatically registered to vote. It goes through and like requires colleges that enroll students. If they accept financial aid, they have to create basically a walk list for Democrat activists. It goes above and beyond to really push the limits of just eliminating all security on voting. We're going to go through this bill in more detail, but if you have a chance, go out to house.mn, go to the bill tracker and type in HF9, and you will find there are also, it's just really sickening how they're trying to allow, really push for college kids who are not at a permanent residence to vote where they go to school. We'll dig into this and do a deep dive so that we can discuss all these amendments we'll be offering to this bill. But it is after this election we had last year, it goes back and puts into law some of the things they pulled last year, and we'll have a good deep dive on this bill. But go ahead and look it up. Again, it's House File 9. On the show this week, we have a great friend of mine, Don Huizenga, who is a GOP activist who I met in D.C. 4 years ago during the inauguration of President Trump. Don, I met you. We were standing outside a hotel smoking cigars. We were wearing tuxedos. It was the night of the presidential inaugural balls. We were both there and had a wonderful time. And I got to know you. You obviously sat out in the crowd in front of the Capitol for the swearing in ceremony. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And then when I look back at the events of that week, because people have said, "Oh, I hope this inauguration for Joe Biden is peaceful," because the one for Donald Trump was. And I said, God, there were people smashing windows. Remember in the news, there were, cars being lit on fire. Antifa was out there wearing masks before wearing masks was a thing. And it was scary. There was a lot of protests around town. Do you remember seeing that stuff too?
Yeah, I remember walking out of the hotel, which was probably 5 blocks from the White House, and there was a massive explosion. I mean, it's literally sounded like a bomb went off, just blocks from me. And I looked down, I think it was K Street or M, and there was a horde, 300, 400 people literally running right at me, and this big, huge plume of orange smoke. And I thought, oh my God. Well, what happened was they had torched a Starbucks, and the police had set off this big smoke bomb thing that sounded like an explosion just to disperse everybody that was there. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I was physically threatened because I was wearing a Donald Trump hat. You can't even count them all. Just walking down the street, having people go, let's beat that guy up, the old guy with the Trump hat, So yeah, there was nothing. The night before. There was huge riots right outside the Willard Hotel, for Pete's sakes. I mean,
yeah, and I remember that Antifa, or people wearing all black and face masks and raising hell in the town, were also throwing flashbang grenades at police, at Trump supporters.
Yep.
I mean, when you and I were at the Republican National Convention, there were some groups that were throwing urine water balloons filled with urine at delegates, but that was extremely peaceful that whole week in Cleveland. The DC thing, people were at wit's end. They were blocking the entrances to see the inauguration. There was threats everywhere. People were rioting. It was definitely not peaceful.
Well, you remember walking down, I think it was M Street or whatever, the main street, to go to that big theater, and they had Secret Service and police out there because people were just chucking like full water bottles at people, where anybody wearing a tuxedo or a gown, ran the risk of like getting assaulted from a flying beer bottle or water bottle or eggs, or there was all kinds of goofy things going on. It was, maybe it was just because it was a more deliberate attack against the people themselves, and they weren't attacking the Capitol or whatever. I don't know, but it doesn't really matter. There was nothing calm and peaceful about that whole inauguration, 3 or 4 days worth.
One of the things that struck me about our conversation that I still remember today was that you talked about how important it was that Donald Trump won the election because of the the presidential or the congressional approval rating and people's faith in government. Do you remember that
Oh,
conversation?
absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of the hallmark of how Americans participate in government is really their faith in government, and it's also, like we talked about, one of the two defining factors in the collapse of any great society. So remember, the first one was the two precursors are, one, a lack of assimilation, and then two, when the governed no longer trust their government. So yeah, those are the two things that are always in the front of my mind when we talk about great societies.
And do you remember where the congressional approval rating was, during the 2016 election?
It was 17%, if I remember correctly.
Okay, that's probably like one of the lowest points in our nation's history.
It has gone down remarkably quick. So in the 70s, I think, obviously during the early 19th century and 20th century, we have this kind of survey that's generated, and it's been kind of a common survey question throughout our history. And believe it or not, yes, they did do surveys and polls 200 years ago. But leading into the 1960s and 1970s, those ratings were still pretty high in the 70%. And I think if you remember, the actual question as it's related even 100 years ago was, do you believe your government mostly good, or good, mostly good, bad, mostly bad? And that was related then, or transferred into, this idea of trust in the government. And so after the 1970s, you see this really fast erosion in those answers, where people then start saying that my government is bad, or my approval rating, or my approval of what the government is doing, is low.
Right. And the reason why I think that's so important, I mean, when we were talking, first of all, when we were in DC, there was a lot of different factions of people that I met. There was a lot of establishment Republicans who just were in shock that Donald Trump had won and they didn't know how they were going to handle it. Then there was this, new wave of Trump supporters. You had the Democrats out there. You had all the young Democrats that, got apartments because they thought they'd have jobs for 4 years because, Hillary was going to win. And you had really talked about that, Donald Trump needed to win this election because if an establishment candidate, Republican or Democrat, had won, that the approval rating and people's faith in government would plummet to a point where it may not return.
Yeah, I firmly believe that. I mean, the party was not in great shape prior to the election. The last two cycles ran some highly establishment style candidates, and from those movements, and the Ron Paul movements, um, came a kind of a desperation within the generation that will become the ruling class, which is our generation. So the boomer generation is kind of the older generation that's hanging on to power right now, but at the same time they're dying out. It's Nancy Pelosi, it's Joe Biden. Joe Biden's an early boomer, but so the next generation that has to accept the throne of that power really had a great distrust, more so in Republicans than it did in the government. And I say that because my generation of Republicans had this Reagan idea of what a conservative was. What they didn't realize until they became 45, 50 years old was that it wasn't actually true. In other words, those type of Republicans didn't really exist in the government, because the people in the government at the time were more boomer Republicans, right? And so they're left leaning Republicans. So the ideological fight happens all the time within a party, and that is when the next generation starts to seize control of those power reins, and then there's this kind of fight between the outgoing establishment, we'll call them, and the incoming generation, which we'll call, just the Ron Paul generation. But what happened, I think, in 2016, and the reason why I supported Donald Trump, was not that he was Donald Trump. I was supporting a president that was from the citizen class. So it's the idea of, is America really a country of, for, and by the people, a government of, for, and by the people? And so I was waiting to see who would emerge from the citizen class, somebody outside of politics that could reignite the Republicans' faith in the idea that America is a country that is run by the people instead of the government. So the 1970s gave us a political class that didn't prior exist. And my generation sees basically the what that political class has done over the past 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. And so now we're fighting against it. And this is the internal conflict that has to happen. Democrats will go through the same thing, but the Democratic idea is a little bit different. Theirs is really how progressive you are, not whether or not you're progressive, but the level of progressivism. So their internal battle, I don't think, will be as nefarious really as ours. Ours is a literal ideological shift. Ours is we don't want our government to be the government that it is now. And so in order to change it, there has to be a literal 180-degree turn in the Republicans that we want to elect to office. And of course, it starts out small, like you and your contingency. But if we had a magic wand and we could flip Republicans the way the Republican politicians are today, we would do it instantaneously if we could. So Donald Trump represented that idea that can America represent, can America elect Peter Pan to the highest office of the land if they wanted to? That's where the real power lies. And that was the real statement. And the answer to that question is yes. And I think that really scared a lot of politicians. I think a lot of establishment politicians and normal politicians were in shock when it came to fruition that citizens of the United States and basic Republicans that had never participated in politics in the last 20 years because they were so disenfranchised with it came off of their bar stools and came out of their trucks and supported this citizen class president. And that was, I think, a saving grace. And I think the Republican Party needs to see it as a saving grace because it will be the saving grace of the party. If the party fights it at this point and says, well, Donald Trump was a fluke and all his supporters are flukes, then the party will flat out collapse. I mean, I can't see it existing.
Do you think that, this election of Donald Trump that happened 4 years ago, because we needed to save people's faith in government, do you think that we have the same issue now where we've lost people's faith in elections because of how the elections were run this year, and that has to be the primary focus for the next year is really on restoring people's faith in election?
Yeah. One of my greatest struggles as chair of the Minnesota Voters Alliance, where we study basically voter fraud or voting irregularity or the statewide voter registration system and how that data is handled at the Secretary of State's office. The struggle internally for me and personally is if you and when you actually get the data that shows that XYZ happens, that this type of fraud, we'll call it fraud. Fraud is the wrong word really, but this type of voting irregularities happen. The bank vault doors are basically open and people are walking in and out taking money all the time is the way to look at it. If you actually present that to the media factually and to a court, I think you run the risk of literally proving that your election systems are flawed and maybe seriously flawed. So if you accept the fact that the election system is flawed, and of course it is, there is no such thing as a perfect election. But if you build on the idea that every year you don't make minor repairs and tweaks to it, that it becomes more flawed every cycle, then eventually the flaws are so deep that they have to be shown the light of day. And so, but then when you show it, like when you actually expose it, there's a risk that you'll disenfranchise everybody from the idea of elections. And so the end result may not be a better election system. The end result might be that people don't want to do elections at all. And maybe you go from being a republic to an empire.
Well, that's a really scary thought.
Of course it is. But this has all happened
yeah.
in the past, Jeremy. We know this.
There was no security on our elections. Our election, and I hate to say this to the media, but our election didn't follow the law. So therefore, our election wasn't lawful.
Right. And that's always the issue. I had a conversation with a known liberal in the gym, and I kind of picked it up because I just challenged him because he was talking to a lady and saying all this election fraud stuff is nonsense, blah, blah, blah. And so I just kind of stepped in and said, I know election law fairly well. And I gave him some of my credentials. I told him our organization actually won a U.S. Supreme Court case over election law, and then proceeded to tell him that the best analogy I could give him to what this election was is because he kept saying, well, they had 60 cases and none of them won in any court. So there wasn't any election fraud. And we know that those cases weren't about election fraud, right? They challenge the authority of the Secretary of State's office under an Emergency Powers Act. Does that power transfer automatically from the governor to the Secretary of State or to his administration? I mean, there's a lot of legality that's never been heard in court because of quote unquote COVID-19. But irregardless, what I said was the best analogy I can give you is that we have states that have laws that basically said, if you own a bank, you cannot lock the vault and you must turn off the camera and you have to leave the doors open at night, so that when a prosecutor can never prosecute a case to figure out who robbed the bank, because the bank is being constantly robbed and nobody knows, right, who is coming in and out and stealing the money. We know the money's gone. We just can't prove it. And so the battleground states in the 2020 election were not states where it was going to be close, or they weren't states that somebody said, oh my God, they're within, a point of each other. No, those were states where various lawsuits filed prior to the election ruled against the rule of law. The courts in those states issued rulings that ran contrary to the prior laws in those states, thus creating a state where ballots would be challenged. Having a recount in Georgia 8 times doesn't matter. The ballots are the ballots. What we're questioning is how the ballots got to the Secretary of State, so or to the county. That's the question. And there's too many ballots. I mean, you and I talked about this. There's way too many ballots. And there's so many statistical anomalies in this cycle that it's almost statistically impossible to have so many statistical anomalies in one cycle. So combined with all of what we know that happened in the states where we know certain things happened and certain rulings were made by certain judges in certain courts, the battleground states were chosen because of that. They were going to be battlegrounds. And we know based on the numbers that there is absolutely no way that Joe Biden got 10 million more votes than Barack Obama. But you can't prove it. That's the issue, is you cannot prove it. And so this guy at the gym, after hearing this, says, well, why should I believe anything you say? And I said, well, I just told you my expertise. And he goes, that doesn't matter to me. I still don't believe it. So in the same irrational kind of mindset that people have out there when they talk about these kind of things, even when you're talking to somebody that has an expertise on the subject and you tell them how it happens, there's this idea in the American mind, and especially in Democrats, that it just can't happen. And I think it's genetic, right? They're just emotional thinkers versus logical thinkers. But a true Democrat always thinks the best of humanity, and a true conservative always knows the worst of it. And so it made perfect sense to me that even though he had heard these facts and heard how it could happen, that he would conclude that it just can't be.
Don, thank you so much for being on the show and for your work as chair of the Minnesota Voter Alliance, and of course for your friendship since we met at the inauguration of our president 4 years ago this week. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Omnibus Podcast. We hope to get these out every week to talk about what's going on inside the legislature, and hopefully also talking to people outside the legislature to see how what we're doing up here is impacting you and your lives. The episode next week, we hope to cover more legislative processes, more things going on the floor, more bills, and get into things in greater details. If you have any requests for what we should be covering, you can email me at jeremy@jeremymunson.com, or you can call or text 507-200-8448. Thank you so much for listening to the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane.